although I didn't, calculate this at the time, grew out of this interest in some way. Who are we? Are we these isolated people tearing at each other, trying to carve up the earth for our own purposes, or do we have some larger, expanded human identity? Maybe someplace in the depth of my soul there was something that resonated with this, but surely as a factual phenomenon, this was simply not possible when I started this.
And when did you turn? When did you begin to say, I believe these people?
Or I take them seriously. The word belief is full of treachery here.
I know,
because
it
has a sense of, we're become part of some belief system.
Well, I know, but I was using it more in terms of take it as credible. It could be, what's your term of?
That's right. It's just what you said. I mean, that it is something that is credible, that involves some kind of reality that these people are encountering, that needs to be taken seriously. And that, I suspected that very soon, but I just didn't have confidence in it. I had to see 30 or 40 of these people, each telling, in different slight differences, highly detailed narratives, terrifying in many instances, which they themselves doubted, which when they would hear that another person had had the same experience, they would become very much disturbed because it meant they couldn't dismiss it as a dream. They couldn't dismiss it as their private mental illness or fantasy. And that, to a psychiatrist, at least to this psychiatrist, was very powerful evidence that something extraordinary was occurring here.
What kinds of things did they tell you, which is part of the book?
Well, the basic story is that a person is in their home or in a car, or in the case of one woman on a snowmobile, or in the case of children in the schoolyard, and a powerful beam of light comes, or they may hear a humming, and they're frightened, they may be paralyzed, they are moved by some energy. If it's in a house, they'll say floated down the hall. They may see these small beams, 3 feet, 3.5 feet tall, a kind of thing that you might think they would be hallucinating. The first response often to critics, well, they're hallucinating. But the fact that thousands of people are having the same images, doubting it, telling it with a great emotional power, that's not the way hallucinations work. It's not a mass hallucination in the sense that, everybody's having this experience. There may be a lot of people having the experience, but they're not in communication with each other. It's not a contagion where people are reacting to one another. So this powerful energy comes, the blue light or whatever it is, and they see 1, 2, 3 beings around them with these huge black eyes, 3.5 feet tall, communicate with them telepathically, and then they are moved up through the sky into some sort of an enclosure. They may see a UFO, they may not see the UFO from the outside, and inside there is a more senior figure whom they call the doctor or leader, and that figure is a little bit taller and seems to be in charge. Inside are all kinds of machinery like computer consoles, instruments, unlike anything we really have, nothing quite like what we have on Earth. The walls are curved. There's a kind of atmosphere that's misty inside often. And then there's a whole set of procedures that occurs, which are very complex. And often what abductees will do when they get together is they will compare, well, what was the instrument that the little creatures stuck into your abdomen or in your nose, and they'll draw them, and they'll be, they'll see that or I've had a little experiment I've done where I have them draw them independently, and they've had the same instrument. Again, that's very strong evidence. John Carpenter, who's a psychiatric social worker who works with this population in Missouri, has a dozen or so cases where he's kept the people apart, interviewed them, explored their experiences independently, and they have like 30, 40, 50 details of what happened in the ship that's identical, and they haven't communicated with each other. So there's all kinds of evidence, but it is evidence of narratives. Kind of evidence that's introduced into a courtroom would satisfy a jury and a judge, but in this case, since this simply cannot be, we're like the approach is often, well, let's find something wrong with the people reporting this, the abductees, or with the investigator, or whatever, but because there's no place for this in our psyches, at least for great numbers of people.
Okay, but let me come back to not get hung up on trip over words.
Okay.
You say these stories are credible.
Mm-hmm.
Do you, as an intelligent person who's investigated it, believe, I don't know if a better word, think it happened to them?
Yeah, again, language, we have that problem. Happened. Okay, let me just...
You think it happened?
Something happened which corresponds to what they're reporting. In other words, I don't think there's
Did something happen in their mind, or did something happen
well, it's,
to their
again,
physical being?
this has forced me to challenge every category I've had, like
All
in
right.
the mind,
Right.
inside, and outside. For example, sometimes people are witnessed to be missing. A child, for example, this is my own case experience, goes in to find her mother during the time the mother's having an abduction experience. The mother's not there. The child tells the mother in the morning, "Mom, I went into your room, you weren't there." Two young people, fathers are desperate in the morning, young teenage girls, they're gone. They say, yes, we were right here sleeping in the den of one of the girls. I've interviewed both girls, and the father, they came back, they were there. There are lesions on their bodies, there are cuts, there are scoop marks, there are intricate lesions that don't follow anything that could be self-inflicted. One person had quadriplegic that I'm working with has this very complex set of ulcers that follow a pattern on his wrist. He can't have done it to himself. Critics say, wait, these are self-inflicted. They're not self-inflicted. But the physical evidence by itself would not stand up. I mean, you couldn't, because again, it's not powerful enough. It's not rich enough. It's the company it keeps. It's the fact that it occurs in conjunction with these extraordinary accounts, which, in spite of all the criticism that I am maybe taking it too seriously or believing this really happened, there isn't a single case where anybody has found another explanation of what an individual has reported.
Why didn't you include the personal histories?
Well, I included a lot of personal history where I took detailed personal history in many cases. In some cases, as for example, Scott in the book, we interviewed practically everyone in the family, in the nuclear family, the brother, sister, parents. As far as we could, we went into every possible person to interview that seemed to bear on the immediate experience. But again, what I was trying to do in this book is to lay out a whole new area that needs investigation, needs much more study, but to set out what are the basic guidelines, what is the basic structure of this field, and see what other people can follow up in more detail. I plan to study or to look at individual cases in much more detail now.
You've seen how many patients?
Of this sort?
Yeah.
Over 90 now.
Over 90. Remarkable similarity in their stories,
yeah,
in their sense of the light and being taken away. How do your colleagues feel about this?
Well, the colleagues vary. I mean, when they, like for example, in the case of Sheila, the psychiatrist who had been working with her, who was a skeptic himself, came in the room during 2 of my sessions. I'm reluctant to call them hypnosis because it's not, with this group, the experiences are so near the surface. If you just listen to them and allow them to relax, the experiences come forward with enormous power. But he, when he was with me, he knew this Sheila very well because he'd worked with her for about 7 years, and he said, something like this has happened to her. I have no other explanation. I know her well. She's not making this up. This is truthful. This is what is going on with her. And then he's been working with me. Yeah.
In the end, that seems to be the most convincing thing for you and for others, is that there's no other explanation. You can't find any other way. You can't find any other way to characterize than to accept.
Yeah, I mean,
Yes,
I mean, I've looked for every possible explanation. Then I begin to ask myself, why is this so extraordinary in this culture? In other words, what is it? I mean, for example...
I can tell you why. I think the reason it's so extraordinary is a culture for us to be unwilling to buy it, to accept it, to believe in it, to find it credible.
Yeah.
I think it is because no one has, they make the point about the evidence. No one has seen the evidence. And frequently the other kinds of witnesses, I mean, of all these things happen for people to be able to confirm, other people to confirm.
But there are, I mean, if you, again, have independent examiners, that they find the same thing. I mean,
they just would, I mean, I think that it's like near-death experiences for people, I think. I mean, it's some of the same kinds of incredulity that, in fact, I died and I saw heaven and I, you know. I mean, I think there's something because you, in the end, it's something you just have to almost take on faith.
But, you know, one of the things that's come to me
Or
as
don't.
I've been dealing with the criticism...
The rational mind in America.
So-called rational mind.
So-called right, all right.
You know, I mean, I came to a point where I began to shift my own thinking and thought, why is this so extraordinary to people? To accept that another intelligence, granted it's taken an odd form, little beings with big black eyes who are sometimes luminous and sometimes less so, entering our world, telling us, doing these experiments, telling us that in vivid terms on television monitors and directly through telepathic communication, that we are causing some kind of ecological catastrophe at a scale that goes beyond the Earth itself, that the Earth is part of some network and that is being communicated, and that there are intelligences in the cosmos that are telling us this. Why would this be so extraordinary? I don't think it would be so extraordinary, and isn't. We're beginning to study this among various other peoples who don't find it that remarkable. It's that we have come to the place where intelligence is simply a phenomenon of the human brain, that the universe is, we've devoided it in a sense of other intelligence. So when it shows up in a kind of odd, frightening form, tells us about ourselves in ways we don't want to hear, the approach is to reject the phenomenon, shoot the messenger. And there's some, because you know, you asked me this, I mean, the intensity of the wrath, in a sense, that I've brought down upon myself for suggesting maybe this would be better to look at it for
How
what...
is that wrath expressed?
Well, it's expressed in attacks that say I have no evidence, I've lost
Or
my...
even to the standpoint of saying, you've done some experimentation with hallucinogenics, haven't you?
Myself, personally,
no. But you've studied...
No, I haven't. I've used this method which uses breath work. I've been interested in meditation. I've been interested in yoga, ways that get into alternative, you know, non-ordinary states where people can access another world. And that may be, in some ways, I had somewhat more openness to this kind of phenomenon. But I was not ready for a phenomenon that was more than simply psychological, which seems to enter and have physical effects on people. This was something that I was totally unprepared for. And yet, it seemed to me that rather than take the phenomenon and reduce it to something familiar where it won't go, just maybe it would be more creative, more constructive, healthier if we would expand our notions of what's real to include something that differs from what we've already believed and known. That might be a healthy thing for us.
I know that this is what I've been told about, and I'll just tell you about this story. And I come at it with incredulity as well in terms of unbelieving these kinds of things, as and people who talk about you, and you've been on other programs, say he desperately wants to believe this. That's okay. People who come with a scientific inquiry also desperately want to believe that they're going to find something. And they also will cite examples of people who have fooled you, who've come forward with a story which wasn't true, which you seem to accept. And they say, does that mean that people can get away with telling these stories so that you will, for the lack of a better word, buy them?
There's a woman, that's all based on a woman that gave a story to Time magazine that she worked her way into our group of experiences, fooled me into thinking that she'd had real experiences, and then she managed to get a splash on that in Time, which has been picked up. I don't know about that. The other experiencers that worked with her or knew her, she was part of the group, thinks that she actually is an abductee who had these experiences, so that they say that she's not just, didn't just lie, which is presumably her principal credential according to herself for attacking me, but she even lied about lying. In other words, that she was in fact an experiencer who found another way for reasons of her own, which since she was someone I worked with in good faith, I'm not going to say what her reasons might be for attacking me. I mean, it certainly got her into Time magazine, and there was a big splash there. But I'm not sure that person, I mean, I certainly could be hoaxed. I mean, I'm not saying I couldn't be, but I'm not sure in that case it really happened. Now, as far as my wanting to believe, people often ask me, what if you're wrong? What if there is some more, quote, conventional explanation? But mind you, that explanation will have to account for all of these narratives among people not in touch with each other, of sound mind, the tight association with UFOs, the fact that the phenomenon occurs in children as young as...
Let me just answer that. There's a huge amount of literature out there, right? I mean,
about
about people, abductees. I mean, you know, novel. A lot of people have written about the experience, and they all pretty much write about the same, the blinding light level. I mean, people coming in, they're all 3.5 feet, and they all seem to look similar to me.
Charlie, I didn't know about this myself 5 years ago. I had there was no stake in having this be so. I'm still, when I'm asked, what if you're wrong? What if someone comes up with another explanation? I said, well, that'll be interesting.
Yeah.
I mean,
well, I would assume you, if you believe in scientific inquiry, would welcome it. I mean,
of course I'd welcome it.
Listen, prove me wrong here,
Prove me
folks.
wrong. Come up with
some
other,
there's a better way here.
But
all I have now is that I'm buying these stories these people have told me, and that I come to this with some credentials that others might not have.
But we do that all the time. That's the fundamental evidence in psychiatry. That's what Freud did. That's what Jung did. That's what Erickson did. Buying stories, I don't know, but we make as careful assessment as we can of what somebody is telling us. Is this a distortion? Is this coming from someplace else? Are they telling us, are they traumatized in some other way and they're blaming it on aliens? No case of abduction has turned out, in my experience, my cases and other people's cases, to be something else, sexual abuse or some other kind of...
None. Nor repressed memory, nothing.
Not one has been shown to be something else.
How important was hypnosis?
It's important, but again, a very basic point, which is often, well, hypnosis gives you false stories. 30% of the material that we get comes before there's any kind of relaxation response or anything that gets called hypnosis. People remember the stories, they remember being taken into the ships. There's a great deal, however, that they feel they're not in touch with, that they're waiting to be able to talk with somebody about. And if you relax them, you don't even have to hypnotize them. If they just relax, this material pours forward with great intensity, terror often, and eventually they come, if you work with them over time, they come to terms with it, and they grow. There's a spiritual growth that goes on here. They become aware that we are connected beyond simply the human relationships with other intelligences, and which, of course, every other people besides us has known from the beginning of time, but for us, who have lost those senses, as poet Rilke said, by which we can know the spirit world. Those senses have atrophied in our time. This may be some way in which we're reopening to a world that is filled with consciousness, with life, with some kind of energies and intelligence.
Let me repeat this. John Mack is a MD. He is professor of psychiatry at the Cambridge Hospital, at the Harvard Medical School, and a founding director of the Center for Psychology and Social Change. And his earlier books included the 1975 Pulitzer Prize-winning A Prince of Our Disorder, a biography of T.E. Lawrence, who, as all of you know, was Lawrence of Arabia. I think it is those credentials that have added something to this. I mean, you come to the table with different kind of credentials, and if someone as smart as you are with your credentials, it adds something to the debate.
That may get me a hearing, but it doesn't get you much further than that. Because at some point, I have to say, okay, study this phenomenon. Don't marginalize it. Don't push it off onto the tabloids. It's something that could be really important for us, for this culture, for humanity. Look at it with me. Study it. Let's find out what it's about. Let's do careful studies of every aspect of this. That's what I would like to see.
I got to go. But what's the next step for you? I mean, let's assume you are, again, and I'm hooked on language. Let's assume you're hooked by this. I mean, you are in this place. You're in this area. Whether you like it or not.
I'd like to pull a few hooks out.
Yeah, I know you would, but they are hooked you, and for better or worse. And some want to rip you apart, and some want to talk about. I mean, I've heard people have said to me, "Look, there's, you got to think about, look at the methodology, and I don't approve of the methodology, and I think that this guy's using hallucinogen, drugs or whatever they say. I mean, he's LSD, he's this, he's that, he's other.
Let's kill the messenger. Let's
they do
look
say
at
that.
what's
Well,
going
they do
on.
say we don't believe him because of this, and we believe he wants it to happen, and all that. You've heard all that.
They even make
not
up
new.
things like some of the things you mentioned about my background. They even make up to make me wrong.
Well, that's why I asked, rather than positing as being true. That's why I asked. But at the same time, the last question, what's next? Where do you go? What do you do? How do you, if you believe in this, as you do, and forget the word for a second, accept it as credible,
okay.
What do you do next?
Well, I think we've touched on it. You get people to look at it with me. You get people who are not hooked, who are responsible clinicians, to look at these cases with me, which we're beginning to do. You look at individuals in greater depth to see, well, could there be some dynamic explanation in them as individuals? We're doing a study like that at the program at do rigorous psychological testing on it. Mind you, whatever the theory is, it has to take into account also the physical findings, the tight association with UFOs, the fact the phenomenon occurs in children under 3 years old. You look at it in other countries, which we're doing, in indigenous cultures. How do they see the phenomenon? We met with a Cherokee medicine woman, and she says, oh, they've been in touch with these beings for a long time, but they don't like to talk about it because people have enough trouble being Native Americans to have to bring this kind of wrath upon themselves. But you ask people who are competent, clinically, scientifically, to look at the phenomenon with you, and let's explore it together. A number of scientists have been interested in doing this. Philosophers I do get a lot of support from philosophers.
Who's the most credible, who would be the best name that's supportive, do you think?
Well, Rudolf Schild, who's a internationally renowned physicist at the Harvard Astrophysics Lab, thinks that work like this, and you mentioned near-death experiences, can rings work, will tell us more about the cosmos than what we're going to learn looking through telescopes. Professor of philosophy, Michael Zimmerman, was former chairman at Tulane University, says this is something that is of extraordinary importance for philosophy, for humankind, and he's been interested, again, in the questions you and I have been talking about what is it about a worldview, our worldview, which makes this impossible, that people cling to so desperately when something new comes along.
I know people that will say about somehow intelligent life on other planets. They'll say would be ridiculous for us to assume that we're so smart, that here on this planet we're the only people who somehow have advanced to the level that we have advanced to. And when you look at what's happening in places like Rwanda, you wonder how far we've advanced.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm out of time. Human Encounters with Aliens, the book Abduction. Dr. John Mack from Harvard University. Tomorrow night, Oliver Stone and Tom Arnold. See you then.